Chapter 8, Covering Their Tracks, the Car Wash and the Cemetery. When criminals plan a murder, they often think about the deed itself. What do we do when we get there? How do we get them in the car? They seldom consider the mess afterwards. In this chapter we follow Tony Carruthers and the Montgomery brothers as they try to erase the evidence of their crimes. Spoiler, they weren't very good at it. We left off with Jonathan "Lulu" Montgomery bragging to his friend Chris Hines that they had got them folks at the cemetery and scored $200,000. Jonathan then asked to borrow Hines's car for a quick trip. Hines, perhaps wanting to avoid confrontation with an armed man, handed over the keys. Hours ticked by. Jonathan promised to return the car in 1 hour, but it didn't come back until 8:30 a.m. on February 25th. When he finally showed up, the car was very muddy. Hines drove James Montgomery and Tony Carruthers to Montgomery's mother's house and then took Jonathan along for a ride. During this trip, Hines couldn't ignore Jonathan's behavior. He described Jonathan as paranoid and nervous, repeatedly muttering that they had to kill some people. Imagine sitting in a car with someone who casually confesses to murder while you're trying to focus on the road. It's like carpooling with a character from a crime drama who can't stop talking about the plot. After dropping off Jonathan, Hines confronted James Montgomery and Carruthers about the muddy condition of his car. Rather than deny anything, James said he'd make it up to him. It was Hines's birthday, so James agreed to give him $20 and, more importantly, to have Hines's car washed immediately. Who wouldn't want a mud-streaked car wash as a birthday gift from a murderer? The four men, Hines, the Montgomery brothers, and Carruthers, headed to a car wash. Once there, James paid an unidentified elderly man to clean the car inside and out. Hines watched as the man scrubbed the interior and the trunk. Carruthers and James stood by, not supervising, letting the old man do his work. It's almost comical, two men who had just buried 3 people alive and trusting the removal of evidence to someone's grandpa. It's like going to a day spa after committing a heist and asking for the deluxe mud treatment. Why were they so concerned about the trunk? Because that's where the victims had likely been transported. Dirt, blood, and other traces could have incriminated them. By paying a stranger to clean it, they hoped to erase those traces. They never imagined that their own statements, not dirt, would betray them. Jonathan had already told Hines they had to kill some people, and his paranoia at the car wash only confirmed the story. In trying to cover their tracks, they were leaving a trail of words. Jonathan's behavior that morning stands out because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. After the car wash, he abruptly left. Carruthers and James Montgomery immediately turned to Hines, asking what Jonathan had told him. Hines, wisely, kept quiet. But the damage was done. Imagine 2 criminals, fresh from cleaning a murder car, nervously quizzing their friend about what another accomplice said. You'd think they'd have rehearsed their alibis. Instead, they were unraveling faster than Hines's muddy floor mats. The paranoia didn't end there. Several days later, James Montgomery went to Hines's house with an AK-47 rifle. He offered it to Hines, saying he had heard Hines was into it with some people on the street and might need protection. James added that the rifle had blood on it, which Hines understood to mean it had been used in a shooting. It was as if James was trying to buy silence with a weapon. Nothing says "sorry about your car" like a blood-stained AK-47. Meanwhile, at Rose Hill Cemetery, an even more calculated cover-up was unfolding. On February 24, 1994, a pressed wood box or vault was placed in Dorothy Daniels's grave during working hours. The box was meant to hold a casket, but Carruthers and the Montgomerys saw another use for it. They planned to hide the bodies there, cover them with plywood and dirt, and then let Dorothy's casket sit on top. You have to admire the dark logistics. They knew a funeral would be held the next day. By slipping the bodies into the grave before the casket was lowered, they ensured the bodies would be sealed beneath and undisturbed. Dr. Hugh Edward Berryman, a forensic anthropologist who helped exhume the grave, later testified that there was no evidence the casket had been moved after burial. Thus, the victims had been placed in the grave and covered before the casket was lowered. The killers calculated that the weight of a casket and vault would keep the bodies hidden forever. Carruthers himself had once remarked that burying someone in a grave was a good way to hide a murder because, if you ain't got no body, you don't have a case. They tried to make that chilling adage a reality by using a funeral as camouflage. It was a twisted form of recycling, reusing a grave for a second burial. To lighten this darkness, imagine the conversation at the cemetery the day before, workers placing a pressed wood vault while someone nearby thinks, this will fit 3 more. Gallows humor sometimes helps to comprehend such cold calculation. What's striking about this phase of the case is the contrast between the killer's careful planning and their careless actions. On one hand, they coordinated the timing of the burial to coincide with someone else's funeral, used a pressed wood vault and plywood to hide the bodies, and burned the getaway vehicle. On the other hand, they blabbed about their crimes to friends, borrowed a car from an acquaintance, left mud and blood in the trunk, and trusted an elderly car wash attendant to erase it. That paradox is part of why this story is so chilling and, at times, absurd. These were not criminal masterminds, they were men who thought they could outsmart the system but couldn't outsmart their own paranoia. Jonathan's admission that they had to kill some people, said to a friend who would later testify, is almost cartoonish in its bluntness. If you were writing a fictional thriller, an editor might cross out such a line as too on the nose. But reality doesn't need revisions. As we draw this chapter to a close, the killers believe they've covered their tracks. They think the bodies are hidden under a respectable funeral, the Jeep has been incinerated, and the evidence has been washed out of Heinz's trunk. They even gift him a rifle to buy his silence. But words have weight. Jonathan's boasts and James's paranoia will soon make their way to the ears of investigators. And that grave at Rose Hill? It won't stay closed for long. In the next chapter, we'll join Detective Jack Ruby and the Memphis police as they follow these threads to the cemetery, exhume the grave, and unveil the horrifying truth. If you need a breather, take a moment. We're about to dig even deeper. Chapter 9, The Grave Revealed, March 3, 1994. In the previous chapter, we watched Tony Carruthers and the Montgomery brothers scramble to hide evidence. They washed Heinz's car, spread paranoia and whispered admissions. Yet despite their efforts, the truth was literally buried, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 9 tells the story of how detectives finally found the hidden grave at Rose Hill Cemetery on March 3, 1994. This moment turns the case from a missing person search into a homicide investigation and brings some closure, however grim, to the families. We'll keep the tone calm and conversational, with a little humor to ease you through the dark. 1 week had passed since Laventhia Briggs filed a missing person report for Deloise Anderson and her son Marcellos. On March 3, 1994, Jonathan Montgomery did something unexpected. He led Detective Jack Ruby of the Memphis Police Department to the grave of Dorothy Daniels at Rose Hill Cemetery. Daniels's grave was on Elvis Presley Boulevard, just 6 plots away from the Montgomery family's own plot. You might wonder why Jonathan cooperated. Perhaps his conscience stirred. Perhaps paranoia made him think it was better to appear helpful. Or maybe he believed the grave would never be opened, and showing it to police would throw them off. Whatever his motive, he pointed to a seemingly ordinary grave with a headstone bearing someone else's name. Detective Ruby recognized Jonathan from earlier encounters and knew the gravity of the case. As he took notes, he couldn't help but be surprised. The grave in question wasn't remote or hidden, it was right there in the public cemetery. People had walked past it for days, attending funerals, visiting loved ones, completely unaware of the horror beneath their feet. You could say it was the most morbid real estate sublet in Memphis. Because the grave belonged to someone else, the police needed a court order to dig. Once the order arrived, cemetery workers and investigators gathered around. Dr. Hugh Edward Berryman, a forensic anthropologist, stood ready. Dr. O.C. Smith, the medical examiner who would later testify about the autopsies, was also on hand. They placed tools carefully, trying to respect the original burial. Daniels had been buried on February 25, just one day after the murders. Workers gently lifted Daniels's casket from the ground. Underneath, a layer of dirt and plywood hid a grisly secret. As they brushed away soil, the outlines of 3 bodies emerged: Deloise Anderson, her son Marcello's, and Frederick Tucker. The scene was surreal. It looked like a nightmare collage, 3 victims bound hand and foot stacked beneath the casket of a stranger. Their hands were tied behind their backs. Tucker's feet were also bound. A red sock around Deloise's neck hinted at how she might have been subdued. And Marcello's jewelry was gone, proof that robbery had been part of the motive. Even the seasoned detectives felt a chill. It's one thing to imagine a crime scene, it's another to see bodies where they shouldn't be. Dr. Berryman later said there was no sign that the casket had been disturbed after burial. That meant the killers had done all of this before the funeral. They opened the grave, lowered the pressed wood vault and plywood, placed the bodies, covered them with dirt, and left. Then the next day, cemetery workers laid Dorothy Daniels's casket on top of them, completely unaware. The killers had counted on the funeral to hide their crime. If Jonathan hadn't talked, it might have worked. How did the forensic team come to this conclusion? 2 key pieces of evidence told the story. First, the pressed wood box or vault had been placed in the grave during working hours on February 24. It would have taken at least 2 people to move it. That same afternoon the killers were busy kidnapping and murdering. Second, on February 25, cemetery workers placed Dorothy Daniels's casket inside that vault. When the forensic team opened the grave a week later, there was no evidence the casket had been moved or that the vault's lid had been shifted after burial. The casket fit snugly. If someone had buried the bodies afterward, they would have needed to move the casket, disturb the vault, and then replace everything without leaving a trace. No such disturbance existed. Therefore, the bodies had to be placed before the casket went in. This realization impressed the forensic team. They were dealing with a carefully planned concealment. While the killers were sloppy in some ways, blabbing to friends, leaving muddy cars, the burial was executed almost professionally. It spoke to Carruthers's comment about hiding bodies to avoid a case, and to the Montgomerys' willingness to use a family plot as a crime scene. It also explained why no one noticed anything wrong at Dorothy Daniels's funeral. The killers had done everything under cover of darkness, leaving the grave looking perfectly normal from above. Let's pause to appreciate how bizarre this is. Imagine you're the owner of a family plot at the cemetery. You choose a final resting place for your loved ones. You don't expect that someone else will come along, slide 3 murder victims under your casket, and use your funeral as a cover. It's like a real-life subplot of a Gothic novel, except it happened in Memphis in 1994. Dr. O.C. Smith's autopsies revealed even more horror. He testified that Deloise died from asphyxia caused by the weight of the bodies and dirt on top of her. Frederick Tucker had been shot in the chest, but could have survived with medical care. Instead, he suffered blunt trauma from the weight of the burial. Marcello's had been shot in the head and neck, the shot that severed his spinal cord paralyzed him. All 3 victims were alive when they were buried. While these details belong more to the autopsy report than the grave discovery, they underscore the cruelty revealed when that casket was lifted. At this point you might need a little humor to breathe again. So let's imagine Detective Jack Ruby's reaction when Jonathan led him to the grave. He might have thought, seriously? 6 plots away from your own family? You couldn't at least hide them under a tree or something? Or picture the cemetery workers when they realized the grave they dug last week contained extra occupants. One might have quipped, well, we did advertise a 2-for-1 special. Gallows humor isn't for everyone, but it can help us process the surreal. Another light-hearted note, the grave was located on Elvis Presley Boulevard. In Memphis, everything eventually leads back to Elvis. You could almost hear the King's ghost humming Suspicious Minds while detectives uncovered the bodies. Sometimes the universe has a dark sense of irony. The discovery of the grave marked the turning point in the case. Now police had physical evidence linking Tony Carruthers and the Montgomery brothers to murder. They also had proof of the calculated burial. In the next chapter, we'll see how the autopsies and forensic testimony further established the brutality of the crime and how investigators pieced together the timeline. For now, take a moment to digest what happened in that grave. Behind a simple headstone lay a secret that blew open a seemingly unsolvable disappearance. It's a reminder that even the most careful plans can be undone by one loose tongue and one persistent detective. Chapter 10, Autopsies, Evidence of Being Buried Alive. The grave at Rose Hill had been opened, and the bodies of Deloise Anderson, her son Marcello's and their friend Frederick Tucker lay exposed. The discovery shook Memphis, but to secure convictions, prosecutors needed scientific proof of what happened. That proof came from Dr. O.C. Smith, the medical examiner. In this chapter we walk through his autopsy findings, exploring how the victims died and what their injuries tell us about the killer's cruelty. We will keep our tone calm and clear, with a dash of dark humor to help digest the grim details. When Dr. Smith and his team removed the bodies from the grave, the scene was heartbreaking. Deloise was at the bottom of the pit, with the bodies of the two men on top of her. All three victims had their hands tied behind their backs. Frederick Tucker's feet were also bound, and his neck showed signs of bruising from a ligature. A red sock was wrapped around Deloise's neck. While the sock may seem like an odd detail, it suggests she was gagged or strangled to silence her during the burial. The state of the bodies told a story even before the autopsies began. Their positions indicated they had been thrown in hurriedly. The bindings showed premeditation. The killers wanted to make sure the victims couldn't fight back as dirt poured over them. In one sense, it resembled a professional job, hands tied, feet bound, yet the choice of a red sock as a restraint hints at improvisation. It's as if the killers grabbed whatever was available. That combination of planning and improvisation runs throughout this case. Dr. Smith's autopsy on Deloise Anderson revealed she died from asphyxia. Several factors contributed: the way her head was positioned against her body, dirt in her mouth and nose, and the trauma from the weight of the men lying on top of her. Simply put, she suffocated under the mass of bodies and soil. She was alive when buried, meaning she felt the weight pressing down and the dirt filling her mouth. It's a terrifying image. To lighten the mood for a moment, imagine someone complaining about a weighted blanket. This was like that, except the blanket weighed hundreds of pounds and spelled doom. A little humor doesn't erase the horror, but it reminds us to breathe while we tell stories like this. The autopsy on Frederick Tucker painted a similarly tragic picture. He had been shot in the chest. The bullet pierced his lung and fractured ribs, but Dr. Smith testified that the gunshot would not have been fatal with medical care. In other words, if Tucker had received treatment, he likely would have survived. Unfortunately, the killers had other plans. In addition to the gunshot wound, Tucker suffered blunt trauma to his abdomen and head, including broken ribs, a fractured skull and a ruptured liver. These injuries resulted from the compression of being buried beneath heavy weight. Dr. Smith explained that Tucker was shot and placed in the grave and then crushed by the pressure of soil, plywood and other bodies. The force caused additional injuries and, combined with the gunshot, led to his death. Imagine being hurt in a car accident and then trapped under rubble. The initial injury might be manageable, but the pressure and lack of air become lethal. Tucker's case is a grim reminder that the method of disposal can be as deadly as the initial violence. Marcello Anderson endured the most complex set of injuries. He had been shot 3 times. One shot was a contact wound to his forehead and was not severe. 2 other shots entered his neck. One of those went through his windpipe and severed his spinal cord. This injury paralyzed him from the neck down but did not kill him immediately. He also suffered blunt trauma to his abdomen due to compression forces. Think about that for a moment. Marcello's was paralyzed but conscious as the killers threw him into a grave and shoveled dirt over him. He could breathe, albeit with difficulty, and he could feel the pressure on his windpipe. Dr. Smith testified that the wound to his windpipe was very painful, and though he could not move his body, he was aware of his surroundings as he suffocated. If a single image from this case stays with you, let it be this one: a man lying paralyzed in a grave, unable to move, feeling dirt and wood pressed down, knowing he is about to die. It's heavy, so let's lighten it slightly. Imagine Marcello's complaining about getting sand in his swimsuit at the beach. Then realize the sand is Mississippi soil and the beach is a grave. Dark humor aside, the contrast underscores the cruelty. Dr. Smith's most damning conclusion was that each victim was alive when buried. None of the injuries were immediately fatal. The asphyxia, blunt trauma and compression were the killers. From a legal perspective, this detail elevated the crimes from simple murder to a calculated act of torture. Carruthers and the Montgomerys didn't just shoot their victims and dispose of them, they deliberately buried them alive, ensuring a slow, painful death. This finding would later weigh heavily in sentencing. Why spend so much time on these autopsy details? In court, forensic testimony is crucial. It bridges the gap between circumstantial evidence and proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Dr. Smith's description of the injuries corroborated Alfredo Shaw's testimony that the victims were kidnapped, shot, and then buried alive. It explained why the bodies were bound and why there were no defensive wounds: the victims couldn't fight back. It also established that the burial was the final act that killed them. Without this testimony, the defense might have argued that the victims were already dead when buried. Dr. Smith's findings shut that door. If you've made it this far, you deserve a breather. Medical reports can be gruesome, but they also reveal human resilience. Consider Frederick Tucker's body. Despite a bullet and heavy trauma, his heart kept beating until he literally couldn't breathe. Or Marcello's paralyzed state: even with a severed spinal cord, he remained aware. This says something about the strength of the human body. It's a strange comfort that even in moments of cruelty, the body tries to survive. And there's room for a little humor even here. Picture Dr. Smith explaining to a courtroom that a red sock used as a ligature became a key piece of evidence. Somewhere, a defense attorney is thinking, we lost this case because of a sock. Or imagine the jurors hearing that Frederick could have survived the gunshot if not for being buried alive. They must have wanted to roll their eyes and say, well, that's Memphis for you. Humor doesn't trivialize the victims, it humanizes the people listening. The autopsy findings set the stage for the next phase of the trial. They provided the factual basis for a death penalty case. When jurors heard that the victims were alive when buried, that they suffered under the weight of soil, and that their deaths were slow, they understood the gravity of the crimes. This evidence would later support the decision to seek the death penalty for Tony Carruthers and James Montgomery. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the investigation tied these findings to the defendants, the trial strategies, and the sentences imposed. But first, take a moment to remember Deloy's, Marcello's, and Frederick. They were more than victims, they were people whose lives were cut short by greed and brutality. Telling their story with care and a bit of humor honors their memory even as we confront the darkness of their deaths. Chapter 11, The Investigation, Witnesses and the Master Plan. We've followed the crime from the plotting to the burial and the autopsies. Now it's time to dive into the investigation that put Tony Carruthers and the Montgomery brothers behind bars. Detectives didn't just stumble upon the truth, they pieced it together from letters, witnesses and jailhouse conversations. In this chapter we'll look at the testimony of inmates Jimmy Mays and Charles Ray Smith, the evidence that Carruthers and Montgomery plotted to rob and kidnap Marcello's Anderson, and the complicated story of Alfredo Shaw, an informant who told and almost untold the tale. As always, the tone will be chill and engaging, with a sprinkle of humor to keep things digestible. Detectives first heard about a master plan thanks to Jimmy Lee Mays Jr. Mays, a convicted felon, had received 2 letters from Tony Carruthers in the summer of 1993 while Carruthers was in prison on an unrelated conviction. Carruthers wrote that he had a plan that was a winner and boasted of his intention to make those streets pay me. He announced that everything he did would be well organized and extremely violent. Imagine reading that from a friend, not exactly a "wish you were here" postcard. The letters were chilling but vague. They hinted at future violence, without naming targets. To lighten this up, picture Carruthers writing his master plan on prison stationery decorated with little flowers. "Dear Mays, hope you're well. By the way, planning some organized and extremely violent activities. Much love, Tony." Humor aside, those letters told investigators that Carruthers was plotting something big and premeditated. Carruthers's ominous letters weren't the only red flags. While working on a prison detail at the West Tennessee Veterans Cemetery, he made a gruesome joke to fellow inmate Charles Ray Smith. As they buried a body, Carruthers remarked that burying someone in a cemetery would be a good way to hide a murder because, if you ain't got no body, you don't have a case. That's the kind of gallows humor that makes you wonder if someone is serious. In Carruthers's case, he was. Smith also testified that he overheard Carruthers and James Montgomery talking about Marcello's Anderson. Carruthers told Montgomery that Anderson and Andre, baby brother Johnson, sold drugs and had a lot of money, and that they could rob and get them when released from prison. Smith later warned Anderson and Johnson about the plan, but Anderson, trusting Carruthers, didn't take the threat seriously. It's like someone tells you not to accept a ride from a friend because he's planning to kidnap you, and you say, "Nah, he's my guy." Tragically, that misplaced trust cost Anderson his life. After being released from prison on December 15, 1993, Smith took his warning seriously and told Anderson and Johnson again that Carruthers and Montgomery planned to get them. Meanwhile, Jimmy Mays, the same person who received the letters, recounted another incident. In mid-December 1993, Mays, his brother and Carruthers were riding around Memphis when they passed a drive-by shooting. Jonathan "Lulu" Montgomery, James's brother, joined them. Carruthers remarked that it was the best time to kidnap Marcello's. Jonathan asked whether they should snatch baby brother or Marcello's, and Carruthers nudged him, saying it would happen after James was released from prison. About 2 weeks later, Mays saw Carruthers loading 3 antifreeze containers filled with gasoline into a car. Mays realized Tony was gathering supplies for something sinister. The idea that he's prepping for a murder like he's about to grill burgers is darkly absurd. James Montgomery was released on January 11, 1994, and his re-entry made things worse. He told Andre, baby brother Johnson, that he was reclaiming the neighborhood and threatened to blow his brains out. He made it clear that he and Carruthers had their man staked out and planned to take his money and drugs. He even said that if the police didn't have a body, they wouldn't have a case. These statements later helped prosecutors show premeditation. The combination of letters, conversations, and warnings created a picture. For investigators, Carruthers and the Montgomerys wanted to kidnap and rob Marcello's Anderson. They believed he kept cash in his mother's attic and wore expensive jewelry. They thought if they eliminated him and disposed of his body, they could take his money and drugs without getting caught. Carruthers's comment about hiding bodies to avoid a case, and James's remark that the police needed a body to make charges stick, supported this theory. Investigators pieced these threads together. They interviewed Mays and Smith. They obtained copies of the letters describing the master plan. They learned that Carruthers and Montgomery targeted Anderson not only because he was wealthy but because he was their friend, someone who would let them close without raising suspicion. It's the classic betrayal story: the enemy looks like a buddy. Perhaps the most dramatic witness was Alfredo Shaw. Shaw was a jailhouse informant who said he was on a 3-way call with Carruthers and one of the Durham brothers when Tony asked him to participate in the murders. Carruthers promised him a sweet plan where each participant would earn $100,000 and a kilogram of cocaine. To lighten this dark plot, imagine the world's worst job recruitment ad. Wanted, accomplice for violent robbery. Benefits include a kilo of coke and 100 grand. Must be okay with grave digging. Tony's idea of sweetness was clearly warped. After the crime, Shaw and Carruthers were housed in the same jail. In the law library, Carruthers bragged that they went to Deloise Anderson's house, looking for Marcello's money. When he wasn't there, Carruthers forced Deloise to call her son to come home. Shaw testified that Carruthers recounted kidnapping Anderson, Tucker and Deloise, driving them to Mississippi, shooting the men, burning the jeep, and then burying all 3 victims in a grave. Shaw even said Carruthers told him Johnson was supposed to be killed too, but things got cut short. Shaw's testimony was powerful, but he later tried to recant. He told the press that his statement and grand jury testimony were fabricated. At trial, he explained that he only recanted because Carruthers had threatened him and his family. According to Shaw, one of Carruthers's investigators arranged for a reporter to interview him about recanting. Shaw said he feared for his life and wanted to avoid retaliation. He finally testified consistent with his original statement after conferring with his lawyer. The jury believed him. Carruthers attempted to impeach Shaw by calling the Durham brothers and a jail administrator to dispute Shaw's account, but the core of Shaw's story held up. Alfredo Shaw's recantation highlights the messy reality of criminal investigations. Witnesses are often vulnerable and easily intimidated. Shaw admitted he feared for his family, and evidence showed Carruthers had a history of intimidation. Prosecutors argued that his recantation attempts were more evidence of Carruthers's reach. Defense attorneys tried to use the recantation to suggest that Shaw was lying. In the end, the jury weighed Shaw's fear against the consistency of his details and the corroboration from other witnesses.